As you may or may not have heard, Nintendo's President Tatsumi Kimishima recently stated in an interview with a random Japanese newspaper that Nintendo hopes to support the Switch for 7 to 10 years, just like the good old days, as opposed to the standard 5 to 6 years that consoles have been known to last for in recent years. But if you ask my wacky ass, I don't think that's gonna happen, at least to the extent Nintendo's implying. My name's Cameron, and I'll tell you why. As crazy as it sounds for a video game console to live for 7 to 10 years, back in the day it wasn't considered all that unusual. In fact, it was actually pretty common. The original Famicom was released in Japan during July of 1983, and the Super Famicom wasn't released until 1990, giving the original Famicom a full 7 years on the market unopposed by another Nintendo platform. And 7 years is the minimum of what the N-Boys are proposing for the Switch. However, just because the Super Famicom was released on the Famicom's 7th year of life, it didn't quite die like my childhood dream of being a proctologist did. There were still licensed Famicom games being released regularly until June of 1994 when the system was 11 years old. And I'm not just talking about shovelware either. Mega Man 6 came out in 93 in Japan and 94 in North America. And the Super Famicom's final game wasn't released until a little over 10 years into its own life, which isn't too bad either. Plus, let's not forget that the original Game Boy had games coming out for 12 years in Japan and 10 in the US. Although, some of the later games weren't that great, with the Game Boy Color being the preferred platform towards the end. The bottom line, though, is that Nintendo had the right idea when it came to making sure people got their money's worth when investing in one of their platforms. With the exception of the Virtual Boy, of course, if you want to be a dick about it. However, as time went on, the waiting gaps between new hardware kept getting smaller and smaller, just like my grain of sand that I call a pee-pee. The 64 and GameCube only lasted 6 years, but to be fair, that was about the same as their competitors. The cycle changed an ass hair with the Wii, with Just Dance being released in 2017 somehow. But everybody knows that the real support for that console stopped about 5 years in with the release of Skyward Sword. And besides that one game, the Wii's 5th year really had nothing going for it. So if we're being honest with ourselves here, the Wii pretty much had a 4-year run. But if you thought the Wii's lifespan was unimpressive, then get a load of the Wii U. More like the PU, am I right? Personally, I liked this console. It's not even my least favorite from the above-average sized end, and I feel like I got my money's worth. However, Nintendo ditching it so quickly really left a bad taste in the asses of many people, because it tarnished Nintendo's legacy of supporting platforms for lengthy periods of time even further. Sega got shit on pretty hard for giving up on the Saturn, but even that lasted longer than the Wii U, so it's nice of Nintendo to be ambitious with the life cycle of the Switch. But come on, let's not kid ourselves. While I love the Switch and think it'll top the Wii in sales and have a great 5 to 6 years, I don't see it truly lasting longer than that. The 3DS was considered a huge success, but that's in its 7th year right now, and it's pretty much as alive as my sex life. Most people seem to want Nintendo to euthanize that to focus all their efforts on the Switch. But even though 7 years was possible for the 3DS, it still needed an upgrade a few years in to keep it going a little while longer because it was pretty much out of date. And while I do agree that despite technology improving more rapidly every year, graphics and gaming matter less than ever. I say it all the time, but they do still matter to some extent. The Switch was underpowered even when it came out, but it's not to an unreasonable amount if portability's the trade-off. It's technically a handheld that can be played on your TV rather than a home console that can be taken with you on the go. And if you consider it to be a handheld, then the Switch is strong as poop. But realistically, it is still looked at as a console at the same time, and by those standards, the visuals definitely aren't going to hold up in 2027. And even though third parties will probably be gung-ho with the Switch for the foreseeable future, many of them probably won't stick around if rival consoles up the ante, at least as far as the multiplats are concerned. One of the biggest reasons why I think the Switch is going to continue to be so successful is because of the third-party support. But even in 2018, a lot of third parties are pissing and shitting all over the place about the Switch being underpowered. I don't think that means third-party support's going to disappear entirely after 6 years if the Switch really does last a decade, but a lot of the AAA multiplats are going to be seen less and less frequently on the Switch if rival consoles get a considerable upgrade. The Switch's portability could still be a good enough reason to port watered-down multiplats over, but there's a pretty good chance that Sony or Microsoft will have new consoles out by then. And if one or both of those are hybrids as well, then Nintendo could lose a decent amount of steam if they're not ready to upgrade their platform. But a Sony or Microsoft hybrid's way too uncertain of a thing to give too much serious thought, so I'm not going to talk about that possibility like it's a fact, because I already did that in another video. But much like the new 3DS and Game Boy Color, the Switch could come out with a new model. And I'd bet my unborn father's life that this will happen. Although, if you ask me, I think that's kinda lame. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd buy it without hesitation, but it's not exactly nice to the early Switch owners who made an investment with hopes of getting at least 5 to 6 years out of it. The new 3DS didn't have too many games that needed the upgrade, so in that case it's not really a big deal. I just don't think the new 3DS is truly a 3DS. Much like the Game Boy Color, the new 3DS is really just a successor to the 3DS that has backwards compatibility and plays regular 3DS games faster, with the same operating system and ability to transfer old data over with like 22 new exclusives and Super Nintendo games on the eShop. But it's technically not a 3DS, just a marginal successor. And even though I'd personally like it if the Switch got the same treatment since it'd be nice to have better graphics, I still think there could have been a better way for Nintendo to go about prolonging the life of the little hybrid that could. Since again, a new model is kind of like giving the middle finger to the early Switch owners if you make games exclusive to the upgraded console. Switch cartridges are going to have a bigger capacity, but other than that, we're not going to see an equivalent to the Super FX chip. Something like the Nintendo 64's expansion pack, though, would have been awesome. That was a completely reasonable upgrade for people who bought a 64 at launch, but there doesn't seem to be anything like that on the tablet, so that's out of the question. I suppose they could make a dock upgrade that actually adds graphical power, but that'd kind of defeat the purpose of the hybrid concept if there were exclusive docked games. And besides, that's bordering Sega CD territory. Plus, it'd probably just confuse people anyway. And despite the Switch being underpowered even when it launched, Nintendo could easily make the Switch last 10 years with their first-party games and inevitable release of their 30-year backlog of classics, even if Nintendo doesn't add any kind of upgrades. Not to mention with indie support and potential third-party exclusives. I mean, the PS2 was underpowered not too long after its launch, and that lasted 13 years. The only reason it was discontinued is because Sony was embarrassed that people were still buying it when the PS4 was about to come out. Even in 2018, it's not that uncommon to find sealed PS2 games at Walmart. I do think it's possible, and actually likely, that the Switch is going to have some kind of support in its 7th year in 2024. But just because Nintendo can make the Switch last until at least 2024 is their main priority, it doesn't mean that they should. The momentum is definitely going to slow down, and even if everyone does buy a new model of an upgraded Switch that can keep up with the PS5 and Xbox 69, that wouldn't count as a 7 to 10 year life cycle, since again, like the new 3DS and Game Boy Color, it would technically be a new console altogether if it had exclusive games. I know Sony and Microsoft upgraded their current consoles, but thankfully none of the games for the PS4 or Xbox One X are exclusives as of yet. Which is a good thing since the people who didn't feel like upgrading don't feel like chumps for not being able to play the new games. Hopefully Sony and Microsoft's upgraded consoles remain optional, with every new game still being playable on the original models, even if the graphics aren't as good. When it comes to Nintendo's claims in recent years of telling people they plan to support a platform, it should be taken with a grain of salt. After all, Nintendo tried looking us dead in the eye and telling us the Switch wasn't going to be the Wii U's successor, and the funny thing is, a lot of people actually believed it. Plus, N-Dog also said that 3DS was going to be supported beyond 2018, which even the Pokemon CEO believed. I mean, it makes sense for Nintendo not to tell people they plan on discontinuing platforms on life support. After all, they're a business and they're not going to want to tell people not to buy their products. It is a little shady, but Nintendo fixed broken NESs for free till 2003, so I can let it slide. And even though N-Dog's not above lying for the sake of selling consoles on death row, I do think Kimishima-chan meant it when he said he wants the Switch to last 10 years. After all, lying about this won't exactly increase the Switch's sales any higher, and I do think Nintendo truly wants this as well, because there's way more money to be made on a console with a high install base than coming out with a new console altogether, as long as people are willing to play the games, that is. It's just that more often than not, people want upgraded graphics so the new consoles are necessary, especially when competitors increase the power. Nobody wants to be late to a console generation after all. Even though the Switch kinda was, but it's technically a handheld, and somewhat of a gray area. I'm sure Sony would love it if nobody had an issue buying games for the PS2 with 150 million consoles in people's homes. If that were the case, then they'd only need to sell a game to 1% of the install base for 1.5 million sales. Which is why I'm sure Nintendo would love to keep one console and handheld out for 10 years. The higher the install base is, then the easier it is to cash in on it and make money. It's for that reason why the 3DS is still hanging in there and why Just Dance is being released on the goddamn Wii in 2017. Selling hardware makes money too, but the profit isn't as high as selling an assload of software with a high install base. Software sales being a better way to make money is why consoles are oftentimes sold at a loss. So obviously Nintendo's gonna do everything they can to keep building on the install base of the Switch and try to keep it alive as long as possible. I mean, why would they want to rush to start from scratch with a new platform? After all, if you were a developer, would you rather make a game for a platform with 100 million potential buyers or 2 million? Sure, developers like to have a little more power, but I'm sure most wouldn't have a problem with making more money just for a game to not look as pretty. If the Switch does last a decade, then in the worst case scenario, it'll probably get obscure third-party and indie support for 7 to 10 years to the same extent the PS2 and the Wii did before, and like what the 3DS is currently receiving in 2018. But that's not what people think about when they hear about the Switch having a potential 10-year lifespan. And that's why I think the Switch can't truly last 10 years, even though I'm sure Nintendo would like to make that happen. The public's gonna want more bang for their buck as technology advances and competition gets more fierce, especially if competitor hybrids become a thing. But again, I promise not to get ahead of myself and speculate too hard on that. All I know is that regardless of their desires, Nintendo's not gonna have a choice but to shift their main focus to new hardware by 2024, and almost damn sure by 2027, even if that new hardware is just a new model of the Switch. Quality first-party content could probably keep the Switch alive for 100 years, but definitely not thriving like they would with eventual new hardware. And where money goes, business flows. What do you think, though? Do you think the Switch is truly gonna last till 2027, happen? Do you think Nintendo will be forced to come out with new hardware? Or do you think making people buy new Switch models to play newer games is just fine? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, I'll pin whatever I find most entertaining. Consider supporting us on Patreon with a new rewards tier now available. Or you can help this channel grow by sharing and liking this video. And if you're a super sexy badass, then go right ahead and press that subscribe button. My name's Cameron, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.